Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Let's go ahead and start off with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump in. Gracious God, I thank you so much for this day, for those who have taken their time out of a Saturday morning to reflect, to go deeper. We pray that you would be here with us and allow us to see you more clearly in what we do and say, and help us to become little glimpses of your presence in the world as we leave here today. In Jesus' name and through your Spirit we pray all of these things. Amen. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. We still got a few people that are coming in as we go, but I'm going to do a little bit of a recap because I know we have some folks that kind of weren't able to be here last week, so we'll do a little quick and dirty. But then we left off, we got mostly caught up. If you remember our first week, it was lots of questions, which were really great in terms of especially framing what it is that we're doing and how we're going about this work. And then last week, we were able to begin to kind of really jump into the story. Who is God? God is one who is transcendent, without limitations. God is also particular. God is present. God is personal. What is creation? Creation is something that doesn't come out of necessity. God doesn't have to do it. It's not an emanation that kind of occurs naturally out of God's own life. It's something that God chooses to create. But in the midst of all of that, it is God who is not over here while creation is here, but there is nowhere where God isn't. And so this creation that takes place, that God chooses to bring into being, opens up inside of God's own life. So creation is a relationship that God has to something that is internal to God's own life. Inside of this creation, in the midst of stars and planets and gases, there's this tiny little rock that begins to emerge with lots of other kinds of things, trees, birds, whatever. It doesn't have to happen over 6 days, but it can happen over a long expanse of time. And what ends up happening inside of this creation is that God begins to relate. God continues to relate, holds it together. God continues that analogy of kind of the spinning in the water, right? And as God kind of spins and moves and wills, there is a kind of space that opens up inside of God's life that is not God, and yet at the same time, God is related to it. God's willing, God's desire, God's love for it continues to bring it into existence. So as we talked about with Abraham Heschel, Clifford Ware also has this idea that creation is not a kind of singular moment in the past, but it is an ongoing reality. God continues to create. Now, inside of this creation, what do we see? We see animals, we see birds, we see land, we see fish, we see all of the things. And in the midst of all of this, what does God do but say, I want to make another creature. I want to make another creature that is bound to the ground. So God takes this ground, molds it, breathes into it, offers something of God's own self to it, and into being is a human person. Now, again, one of the things that we talked about is that these human beings are not the best, they're not the worst, they are just one thing among all of creation. But like all things that are created, they exist in a kind of particular relationship to the other things around them, to God, to the ground, to one another. And so when we think about human beings as, quote unquote, the imago Dei, the imago Dei, this likeness, is not a kind of hierarchy. It's not something that is closer to God than all of the other things that exist. Rather, the imago Dei is simply the way that human beings try to describe what are the ways that we are like God. Now, we talked a little bit about how in the past, some folks tried to think about this likeness in terms of rationality, for example. Oh, we have the capacity to think, to be self-reflective. Or others talked about this idea of creativity, that we can create. Others named it as this idea of free will, that we can choose and decide of one thing among other things. But in all of these things, they all kind of were grounded on the presupposition that we are somehow greater than, better than other animals that existed. And not only are we better than, but because of this rationality, because of this free will, we should also have sovereignty. We should have a power over, that everything else exists for our use, not necessarily in a kind of symbiotic relationship. So how then do we, if this is a kind of problematic way of thinking about our human likeness to God, what were some of the ways that we begin to reframe what our likeness to God might be? And so I suggested 3 different ways of thinking about this, or 3 different characteristics. So one is this kind of union of flesh and spirit, which essentially is to say that in the identity of each person is fundamentally a kind of relationship to the other. The other is present in me, and I am present in the other. And how is this true for creatures, for human beings? That we are of the ground and we are of God. That we cannot understand ourselves fundamentally in any way apart from a likeness to the animals, to the dirt, to all organic matter that exists around us. And at the very same time, we are like God in that God has breathed into us. God holds us together. There's something about our form and our shape that God allowed that is like God in God's breath and soul. We talked about this idea of relationality, that not only is there a kind of relationship internal to who I am, but there's also a relationship to others who are like me, who are of the same stuff, right? So it's not good for Adam to be alone. He wakes up, sees another who is like him. Not him, but like him. And so he is not imago Dei, she is not imago Dei, we are not imago Dei if we are not with another, with someone who in a sense can choose, can love, can be understood as being bound to us. And this is not a marital relationship, it's not a romantic relationship, it is simply what it means to be human, right? And this is internal to God's own life, as God as triune, as the first, second, and third persons of God's own life. And then lastly, we are free. But it's not a kind of freedom to be able to do whatever it is that we want. And sometimes we even maybe imagine God as transcendent, that God can do whatever God wants. But in some ways, that doesn't quite make sense in the sense that because the idea of what we think we can do is always bound up in what we want to do, what we hope to do, the things that we love, right? And so in God's own life, God is free. But that freedom is always oriented perfectly toward the other inside of God's own life. We might call the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit the first, the second, and the third person of the Godhead. But this freedom that God exists is always moving towards love, in love for the other, forever and ever, as an eternal reality. When God opens up this space in God's own life to create, says, let there be, what God is then saying is, I want to share this love. I want to be free for this thing inside of me as well. So that when God creates these human beings who have the capacity to love, and God creates any creature that has the capacity to love, that love is participating in God's own personhood. We are free to love, and when we are free to love, we're not free to do whatever we want. We're free to orient, to use our agency, to be able to move towards another, towards the ground, towards the earth, towards God, in hope and faith that they will also move towards us. And so then we talked about, well, what goes wrong, right? This lasted like a day, right? All was well, maybe, who knows? All lasted to a day, and then we talked about this idea of the fall, right? And in the midst of the fall, there's the possibility that maybe it wasn't just that Adam and Eve ate the fruit. Maybe that wasn't the moment of the fall. That perhaps the moment of the fall was actually when God confronts Adam and says, what went wrong? And then instead of Adam saying, you know what, we love the fruit, we thought it was really going to be great. We didn't think it was going to be that bad. We were really curious. God, we're really sorry. We ate it. Our eyes were opened. We saw too much. I don't know what to do with this body that I have. I don't know what to do with these desires I have. I don't know what to do with what I can't have. I don't know what to do with anything. God, please help me. But instead of saying that, what does Adam do? Adam says, it's that one that you gave me, right? Tries to create his own righteousness, right? He tries to articulate his own freedom, right? But the only way that he can articulate his own freedom outside of love is through articulating a freedom from something. In a kind of distorted invocation of the I am, we might say. Adam says, I am apart from this one. I want to be understood apart from this. It's no longer bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, right? I am my own person. Take me on my own terms. And we begin to see the kind of unraveling, the fragmentation of this this Edenic kind of space. Relationality, again, separate. And then consequently, the kind of fragmentation of body and soul or flesh and spirit is we see an alienation from oneself, right? That they are embarrassed, they are ashamed of their own bodies, ashamed of their own thoughts, ashamed of who they are. There's an alienation from the land where the land no longer feeds them, but they tear it and shred it in order to cover themselves. And then we also see the introduction of, I would say, like, not death in general. I talked a little bit about this in different places, that I think death is in Eden. I think we die, even in Eden, possibly. But instead, what we might say is that there is a fragmentation of our bodies. We die when we're not supposed to die. We die, we live shortened lives. We live lives that somehow we are pressing and stretching and working against our own lives in such a way that we become dust in the ground and our soul grieves for the body, its particularity, its personhood, in a way that God did not intend for. So this is the fallen condition. Everyone trying to somehow scrape together a life for themselves, but not ever quite seeing how the ground, how their community, how one another is actually the possibility of their own wholeness and their own life with God. Instead, what are they doing but scrapping together just to survive? And everything that they confront, whether they be individuals or other peoples, are competition for their own survival, competition for their own resources. And so what does freedom become? But freedom becomes that who is the most powerful. That it's the one who can create the most protection. The one who can create and garner the most resources to determine their own life. So what we want to do today is we want to think a little bit about two aspects. I just love this so much. It makes me so happy. I want to talk about two different things in the fall before we start talking about Jesus. And one is a big question that started to come up, which is the question of evil. And then we also have to answer this question of what is sin? What is sin? But before we do those two things, I want to just name two aspects of this fallen condition that we always have to be mindful of. And it's sometimes, especially in kind of traditional notions of theology and theological kind of systems, and it works its way into church in all kinds of ways, is that sometimes we think of our fallen condition as an individual condition. There is something in me that's rotten. There's something in me that is displeasing to God. There's something in me that is broken. There's something in me that is sick. There's something in me that is diseased, right? And we extrapolate that forward and say, well, how is God going to fix it? Oh, an individual needs to die so that my individual self can go to heaven, right? That's kind of generally the story that we hear. And so for all of the descriptions, all of the aspects that I described, I think we could all very easily imagine the ways that those worked out in our individual lives. Whether it be shame, whether it be a kind of will to power, whether it be lying, whether it be coveting something that isn't yours, whether it's a deep, profound dissatisfaction with your life in whatever reason because there's a better life over there. I mean, any myriad of things, right, we can imagine for our own self. But at the same time, part of what we have to account for is that this fallen condition, this kind of fragmentation of the self, this kind of othering, this kind of refusal, this establishment of oneself over against another, is not just an individual act, it's also a communal act, a social act, an act that kind of begins to reproduce itself regardless of whether or not the individuals as a part of that society are fallen in that way or not. So to give you an example, in the post-antebellum and post-Civil War society, there was something called the Black Nadir. So if you remember the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, the Northern Army was occupying the South, made sure that everyone could vote, or that black folk had the right to vote. Eventually, the northern factories get kind of tired. They want cheaper cotton. People are tired of their soldiers being away from home, and so through these various backdoor deals, the Union armies are withdrawn, and in comes the Ku Klux Klan, right? Through a kind of violent retaking of the polls, so on and so forth. So from roughly 1890 to 1920 or so basically right up until the First World War, there's something called the Black Nadir. It's where you had something, it's roughly, and these are just documented accounts, up to 5,000 to 6,000 lynchings in the course of 30 years. Black Nadir, Nadir. And in the midst of all of these lynchings, these were, frankly, Christian folk, white Christian folk, who were doing this. Who, someone on a Saturday night would accuse a black person of looking the wrong way or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and then Sunday morning, you would find this person's body burned, hung from a tree. And Sunday school, the children, the parents, the community would go out to the garden, go out to the square as part of their Sunday morning worship to look at the burned body, to take bones and souvenirs and give them to their children. So what is it like? What is that? On the one hand, we could say, yes, each individual person that was there was terrible. We could definitely say that. But that doesn't account for the social formation, the social process, the systemic body, the way that a people began to narrate their righteousness, their wholeness, through the objectification and violence and death of another body, in such a way that they believed they were doing God's work. So for every single one of those flesh and spirit, relationality, freedom for, and the distortions of fallen condition, we begin to see that these are not simply individual decisions, but these are the accumulation of formations, of patterns that begin to take on their own life. You could be a great person. You could be a holy person. You could have the best of intentions, and yet you are formed inside of a social system where you inherently believe that your life is worth more than another's. So the fall is an individual thing, yes, absolutely. But the fall is also a social and systemic reality. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when we get to Jesus, so one of the things we talked about last week was however you narrate the fall, that's how you've already set up what you think salvation looks like. Whatever you think went wrong is what you think Jesus is going to set right. And so, on the one hand, yes, we could talk about individuals all day, but if we don't name the ways that the social systems are also participating in, shaped by, multiplying even, then we will not have a way of accounting for, we will not have eyes to see what it is that Jesus is doing in the midst of this work, either individually or in the social systems as well. So, what then is sin? So notice if you go back to Genesis, no one ever talks about the notion of sin is not actually in Genesis. God doesn't roll up into Eden and say, Adam and Eve, you sinned, bad person, right? God asks them questions. God does offer some curses, and we can talk a little bit about the curses if we have time a little bit. But what is sin? Sin is the way that we try to account for whatever it is that we are naming as broken. So, and these could look lots of different ways. It could be we're sick. It could be that we made a mistake. It could be that we were disobedient. And notice each one of those has its own connotation, right? So if we're sick, we need healing. If we're disobedient, we need to be forgiven or make restitution in some way, right? So all of these are kind of hanging together in various different kinds of ways. So for us, what we might say is, what is sin? Sin is that which, I don't want to say separates us from God, but that which causes us to not be able to participate. So put it in a different way, we could say, if this is our life, if this is God's life, this blue line, our life exists inside of God's own life. Inside of God's own life, there are rhythms of love and life and righteousness, and God creates us to move inside of those, to move with them in a kind of dynamic reciprocity. And so part of what happens in the fall, or what we might say as sin, is that we see this in Adam and Eve, we try to extricate ourselves from the pattern. We try to pull ourselves away from the current of God's love, thinking that we can sustain ourselves outside of that space. Now, of course, this is all delusional because we can't get away from God. We can't be separate from God. This is where this language of separation is always a little fuzzy to me. We can't really separate from God. But what we can do is we can push against the current. One of the examples I gave last week was that our human condition, our being in Imago Dei, is like we're sandcastles, right? And as long as we exist in spaces of moisture, as long as we're kind of next to the ocean and the water is kind of lapping up against us, we have that which allows us to keep our form. But in our fallen condition, we think that we can be sandcastles farther and farther and farther away from the ocean. And as we get farther and farther away, our form begins to shift, the grains begin to fall away, and we're constantly, frantically trying to hold ourselves together as best we can. So what is sin, we might say, in this story that we're telling? Sin are the ways in which we try to establish ourselves, try to exist apart from God's life and love in all of its various ways. What are the wages of sin? Death. What is that death? That death is not just the fragmentation of my body and soul. The wages of sin are my loneliness. The wages of sin is the violence that I accept or inflict upon another for my own righteousness. The wages of sin are the self-deceptions that I endure in, thinking that all of the things I am doing to accumulate power are actually creating freedom for me. All the while, I am rotting away inside. The wages of sin is death. So then what does evil have to do with any of this? Where does evil come from? What accounts for evil? Is God responsible for all this? Is God punishing us in some ways? And so one of kind of early church father talked about the idea of sin as being the absence of God. Right? Now, part of what Augustine is trying to do here is he's trying to solve a problem, right? All theology is just trying to solve a problem. We're kind of in a little bit of a conundrum, right? Because if God is in control of everything, if we think about the providence of God, that nothing happens without God's determination, which is one way of thinking about it, then this creates a problem for evil, because it would mean then God is responsible for evil, right? So what Augustine says is that no, God isn't responsible for evil. God doesn't create evil. Evil is the absence of God. And this, I'll just be really frank, like this has never quite been a very satisfying answer to me. In part because where is God? Where is it that God is not, right? Where is it that God is not involved in some form or fashion? And so then if that's true, then how do we begin to account for evil? How do we begin to account for evil in such a way that on the one hand accounts for our agency, our freedom to love, to be with, to resist and to not love, to hate? How does it account for the things that seem to push and seem to be so contrary to God and God's desire and hopes for us? How can we begin to think about this? So what I want you to imagine is a child in the womb. Imagine those little pictures of the child in the womb. And, and the child likes to do handstands and flips and kicks and all that wonderful stuff. I've only experienced it from the outside. So some of the women in the room can identify with what it feels like inside. But this child loves to just flip around. But the problem is like this dang umbilical cord, right? Every time he tries to do his triple axel with a twist, it always gets hung up on his ankle, right? It's like, I can't finish this. So what does he do? He begins to twist at the umbilical cord. He twists, he punches, he gnaws, and finally, it breaks free. He does his triple axel with whatever, and he thinks, oh, finally, I'm free, right? All the while, he separated himself from the very thing that gives him life, right? But again, if anyone knows anyone who's experienced a miscarriage, right? That child will die. But not only will that child die, but the child can't remain in the womb, right? And it can't remain in the womb because infection will come. But where does the infection come from? Was it always there? Was it always lurking? Or was it that the conditions of life shifted, changed in such a way that the proliferation of infection could now take place and overtake the entirety of the space? So when we think about what evil is not a thing in and of itself. It's not something that God intends. but evil is the proliferation of a life that overcomes and overtakes the balance of life that God creates and intends. And I think one of the things that we have to account for, we have to think a little bit about, is that love will always risk evil. I think that's the only thing, we have to say it. There is no love without the possibility of evil. Because love is a kind of movement towards, it is a reciprocity. It is not a kind of order that can be given. It's not an obedience that can kind of be demanded. You have to want to be there. You have to be wanted. The parties have to move towards one another, right? There has to be a kind of reciprocity that is happening inside of this ecosystem that is not contingent on natural laws or movements. Everyone has to want to be there, however imperfectly. And so if the whole thing exists on the love and the desire and the hope and the faith in the other, what that also means that at any given moment, someone can say, I'm out. And as soon as they say they're out, the stream begins to dam up. The water grows still. The bacteria begins to multiply. And things that were not intended to be in the water, but always had the potentiality to be there, overwhelm, overtake the entirety of the body, of the stream. So what is evil? Evil is that which is the kind of life that proliferates in such a way that it consumes everything in its midst. Out of balance with the ecosystem, out of balance with life and love. And in a very real way, what we might say is that our sin, our fallen condition, is always a decision between evil and love. It is the way that we either bend into the proliferation of violence or we bend into the waters of love. Now, in the midst of all of this, again, this is why this cosmology is so important. All of this happens inside of God's life. Which means that as dire, as horrible, as violent, as bleak as evil seems, it can never overtake God's life. Now, does that mean that God controls it? No. But it is never bigger than God. So then the question is, how then will we participate? How will we live into this in some ways? So the question is evil have to have a people or a person creating it, or is it something that can exist in and of itself? Which is a really, really important question. And I think in some ways this comes back to this relationship between the individual and social. And by social, we can use this as in terms of a broad sense of it, not just kind of cultural social systems, but whether we think about them as biological systems or the kind of complicated interrelationship between mental health networks and social services and biological realities and all of this stuff. But again, evil is not a thing per se, right? Evil is an effect, we might say. And part of the reason why I want to maybe even complicate the language of evil is that more often than not, we invoke the language of evil because we want to justify our violent resistance against it. We want to defeat it, right? And oftentimes, people personify evil. And it becomes much easier to say, how do we defeat those people who personify what evil is? So I think part of what I want us to begin to do is, and I think this is why the language of sin as individual and social realities, that it accumulates in such a way that it has the effect of the feeling of evil in our life. On the one hand, it is wrapped up in our individual realities, in individual people. But it also does not necessarily require the individual necessarily. Like we could say, if you look at just the sheer wealth, income inequality gap in the United States, we could say that that's evil. I think we have to say that's evil, right? But can you locate one particular person that's responsible for it? Like, no, right? It is the accumulated effect of millions of decisions by individuals and corporate and communal and social bodies in lots of ways. So I think we have to kind of always navigate those things. But then I think the other thing that we should also say is that in the past, whether they be people with issues of leprosy or possessed by the demonic or women who were smart and had an opinion that these were characterized as evil, right? Because they didn't fit into a kind of set of categories, right? So again, the way that evil gets used and deployed as really a function of identity more than anything is always something that we have to be thinking about. Okay, Jesus, yay! Now, things got bleak there for a minute, but Jesus is on the way. Don't worry. So the question is, how then, we can do our who is Jesus, what is salvation slide. I skipped a couple of them. Who is Jesus is really now what we're going to begin to do is beginning thinking about this question of what is salvation. And in a lot of ways, these ideas are fundamentally bound up with one another. The ways that you're thinking about who Jesus is, the ways that you're naming who he is, his person, his work, you are also beginning to draw the very explicit outlines of what salvation is, what salvation looks like. And so we'll begin at the beginning of Jesus' life, the incarnation, right? So super basic, the incarnation is the divine word, the eternal word made flesh, become flesh. There is the kind of conviction and belief that this person, Jesus, is fully God and fully human being. Fully God and fully human being. And these are important claims that we have to make. And so we want to ask ourselves, and some of the questions that theology is always kind of struggling with, is like, what is the significance of Jesus' personhood? Was he fully God? Was he a real human being? Was he, whenever he was doing miracles, was that the divine part of him that was just kind of like activated? And then whenever he was like, I don't really know everyone, that's the Father's business, that was his human side kind of activating? Like which is which? How do we understand this relationship between these? What's the relationship between his person and his work, the things that he does, right? And then how does this understanding of Jesus shape how we understand ourselves? Because again, right, we're going to talk about Jesus as the archetype of human personhood. And by archetype, we mean the kind of blueprint, for lack of a better word, of what it means to be a human being. So who is this Jesus? How do we begin to account for him? So two claims that we want to make, and this can be our next slide, is that Jesus is the Son of Mary and that Jesus is the Son of God. When we say that Jesus is the Son of Mary, we're referring to his humanity, that he eats, he hungers, he thirsts, that he can die, that there are things that he doesn't know. But as Howard Thurman reminds us, talking about Jesus as the son of Mary is also a reference to his Jewishness. Mary was a Jew. So this quote comes from Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited. He says, if we dare take the position in Jesus, there was at work some radical destiny. It would be safe to say that in his poverty, he was more truly son of man than he would have been if the incident of family of birth had made him rich, a rich son of Israel. So kind of to add what Thurman is, the layer that Thurman is adding on here is not only was he a Jew, but he was a poor Jew. He was a Jew that had no recourse. And in some ways, he talks about this in the book a little bit later. Like, Paul was a citizen of Rome. And he says if Paul was, thrown into a ditch by somebody, Paul could go to the authorities and say, like, I want you to find the person that threw me in the ditch, and I want justice. But if Jesus gets thrown in the ditch, Jesus is just another Jew in the ditch. He has no recourse, no power. So he comes from a people that of Nazareth who are dispossessed, who are literally on the margins, who are policed constantly by the empire, used for their resources and controlled so that they don't become a problem people. There's actually interesting literature that's emerging by Mitzi Smith who suggests that actually that there's a strong likelihood that Mary might have actually been a slave herself, which means that Jesus would have been a slave. So part of what we mean by Jesus is the son of Mary is to say that Jesus is human in all of the ways that we are human, that he has an ethnic and religious particularity, and that his Jewishness here is important not just because it is a religious particularity, but also because Israel are the people that God creates to share God's name. Remember, we talked about this a little bit in the first week. God creates a people in order to articulate, to speak God's name into the world, right? And out of these people comes Jesus, comes this person. So it's not an incident. God doesn't say like, what food do I really like? Oh yeah, I really love that Jewish flatbread. Let me become part of those people. It's not an accident, right? It is actually deeply consistent with the ways in which God has been relating and moving with creation in Israel's own life. So this is part of what we mean when we say Jesus is the son of Mary. But we also say that Jesus is the Son of God. And what we mean to say when we say Jesus is the Son of God is that Jesus is transcendent. That Jesus is without limitation. That Jesus is eternal. That he is all of the same God as the Father and of the Spirit. And that there is no distinction between them in terms of the homoousios, right? The substance of who he is. Now already you kind of like, if you're kind of tracking these two categories, you're like, like these do not seem like they quite jive, right? On the one hand, he's limited, he hungers, he can die, there's stuff that he doesn't know. But on the other hand, he's unlimited and he's transcendent and he's eternal and he's always been and he never changes. Like, somebody's got to be wrong about this, right? Welcome to theology. This is the kind of conundrum that we try to kind of articulate. Now, where is it that this stuff comes from, though? Okay? Sometimes we kind of think of that theology as just a bunch of people sitting around a table just creating philosophical problems for ourselves. But again, remember, in the first week we talked about all theology emerges out of encounter. We're encountered by something. And so these two claims emerge out of the followers of Jesus' encounter with him. Right? Why is he the son of Mary to them? Because they're sitting around and he's eating. And he says, I'm hungry. And he says, I'm tired of all these people. Let's take a boat across the week because I need some me time. Right? Obviously he dies. Obviously he mourns, he grieves, right? These are all of the accounts that we see. So he is a human being in ways that we are a human being. At the very same time, though, he says some very scandalous things about himself. He says things like, I am before the temple was. I am before Abraham. He forgives people's sins, which only God can forgive. He talks about himself as being there before creation, as participating in creation even. So these two ideas are not coming up because of some sort of philosophical puzzle. They emerge because these are accountings that people have written and passed down over time and said, this is who Jesus was. And so as theologians, we try to figure out what is the relationship between these two encounters and what do they mean for our salvation. And there's a lot at stake in what we mean by this and what happens. So part of the reason why we think about Jesus' personhood, and there's a relationship between Jesus' person, and so we mean by person, it's who he was, frankly, right? What was his identity? What was the constitution of who he was? And then we think about his work. So Jesus' person and Jesus' work. His work being, what is it that he does, right? So in the midst of all of this relationship between person and work is very, very important because his identity is tied to the nature of his work. So when I get, this wouldn't work really well in this class because no one's getting grades. But in my other classes, the way that I talk about this is like if PG were to come into a class where we had a grade, and she were to say, hey, Elder June, guess what? Yeah, you got a D. Sorry about that. I'm going to need you to try a little harder next time. Elder June would be like, I don't know who you are. You're a student just like me. Like, what are you talking about, right? Because, so here's where the relationship between the identity and the work comes in, right? Because PG's identity as student, her work, in terms of grading, has no efficacy. It doesn't matter, right? Whereas if I come into the room, I say, hey, Elder June, guess what? You got an A. And you're like, well, I didn't do any work. It doesn't matter. You get an A. That has efficacy because my personhood is professor, right? So there is always a relationship between the nature of the person and the nature of the work. And this is why these Christological controversies, these arguments over Jesus' personhood are really important. Sometimes, especially in liberal spaces, we go like, let's not worry about all that myth stuff, and it just seems like it's just all made up. Jesus was just a really good person. You should be a good person too. We're like, okay, that's great, but so was Moses most of the time. So was Abraham most of the time. So was Ruth. There's lots of good people, right? But nobody says, oh, because Moses broke the bread now is holy. Nobody says, oh, because Ruth gleaned wheat, we should all eat wheat, and by partaking of the wheat, we somehow participate in Ruth's act. We don't talk about that. Because all of those people are people just like us. But Jesus is like us, but also not like us. Which means the nature of his work is different. The nature of what he does something to us in a different kind of way. And so so now we're going to have to think about, well, what is that work? And how does that work begin to speak to the patterns of our fallen condition over time? So the next passage I want us to read and think about is Jesus' personhood. Oh, wait, did I? Oh, shoot, I forgot the best part. Can we go? I'm dropping everything, jeez. Okay, can we go to the slide, the Who is Jesus slide, the Son of Mary, Son of God one? I got all excited, I got ahead of myself. So the Son of God quote comes from Irenaeus of Lyon. So he's writing in the late second century. against these folks called the Gnostics. The Gnostics are a bunch of people, or it's a group of ideas, but generally what holds them all together is that they thought the flesh, the material world, was a lie. And that what was truly God was spiritual. And that they had a secret knowledge about what the truth was. And they saw in Jesus someone who was a kind of prophet or a speaker of that truth to us. So one of the things that Irenaeus is writing against the Gnostics is he's kind of going over and over again. Jesus was really human. Jesus really ate. Jesus was a human being like you and I were a human being. But then he also talks about this idea of his divinity, that he was eternally begotten, is sometimes the words that we use. And so this passage kind of gets at that, and I want to kind of use it to point towards the significance of his life and ministry here in a second. He says, "For this the Word of God became man, and the Son of God, the Son of Man, that man mingled with the Word and thus receiving adoption might become a child of God." So what Irenaeus has in mind here is that, yes, he is a human being like we are a human being, right? But in our kind of fallenness, we've kind of torn ourselves away from the stream. We've torn ourselves away from the kind of current of life. And so for Irenaeus, what does it mean to kind of bring us back, to restore us, is that the Word, eternal Word, becomes like us. And as that becomes like us, it draws us back into the stream. The kind of fancy word, because you're all here for fancy words, and this is part of it because I really love it, is a Latin phrase called communicatio idiomatum, or the communication of attributes. So what Irenaeus is saying here is that in God's own life, there are the attributes of love. There are the attributes of relationality, the attributes of identity, of flesh and spirit, and union of personhood, oriented perfectly towards the other. In our brokenness and our fallen condition, we are the attributes of individuation, of refusal, of death, of self-deceit. Or, and Irenaeus is like mortality, we die. Perishability, we perish, we rot. And so for Irenaeus, how is that which is perishable, mortal, going to become immortal and imperishable? It can't just sit there and be like, imperishability, I did it. No, for Irenaeus, the only way that something that is perishable can become imperishable is if that which is imperishable comes into contact with it, becomes like it. The way that early church father Athanasius puts it, he uses this example of like a village. And if a king is going to kind of come to the village, the king doesn't necessarily need to go to every single house for every person in the village to say, oh, the king bestowed us with their glory and power and blah, blah, blah. The king only has to go to one house. The king goes to one house. Everybody in the village says, the king visited us. Another way the Athanasius puts it is that God glorifies the body by being in it. God glorifies the body by being in it. Takes the fullness of his love, the fullness of his relationality, the fullness of his freedom, and becomes a human being. Now again, the nature of who he is, his personhood is very important here. Because now that he has become like us, we are also now like him. There is no human being who ever was, who ever will be, who is not now, not just like God, an image of God over here, but in the incarnation, in the Word become flesh, we are in God's life. And God is in our life. And in doing so, God communicates these attributes, this life, this breath into our life, into our body, into our existence. To put it in a different way, another kind of phrase of the church is God becomes like us so that we might become like God. And that which he does not assume, he does not save. He assumes, he takes up our life. And in doing so, that taking up, that moment of incarnation radiates, ripples through the entirety of creation. From the very first moment of Jesus' conception, God becomes like us. Now, the other thing that I want to say here that we have to be thinking about is that this all happens inside of what we might call a larger economy of God. By economy of God, what we mean is the way that God does something, the way God goes about things. And one of the things that we notice kind of throughout the entirety of God's work is that God is involved, obviously, in the kind of like holding things together, but that's frankly kind of abstract. But in this God's kind of personal nature, presence, God also always has a particular relationship with that which God creates. But that particular relationship always comes through a point of contact, right? God creates all the things that are, and then God creates human beings who have a part of God's own self. Out of these human beings, God creates a people, out of Abraham and Sarai, to speak of God's name. Out of these people, God then becomes flesh into a singular person to participate, to draw us into God's own life. God is always moving and participating through presence, but always a particular presence. And through that particular presence, God speaks to the whole. God doesn't have to say, everyone's forgiven. God says, you're forgiven. Because God forgives you, everything else becomes forgiven. God says, I love everyone by sitting at that table. And we see this over and over and over again. So part of this economy of God is that God saves by being with. God doesn't save through pronouncements. God doesn't save through, hey, I'm going to give a blanket sheet, everything's all fine. God doesn't save by like reorganizing things. God saves by becoming like. And by becoming like, God also speaks to the whole. And we have to begin to think about this in terms of Jesus' life and ministry. Because when we begin to see the significance of of Jesus' personhood, his person as doing work, what we can then begin to see is that, oh, wait a second, Jesus' birth was not a 33-year waiting time to death, which in so many Christian circles is the way that we imagine it. The substance of salvation is the cross and resurrection. And if that's the case, why 33 years? Seems a little random, right? If it was about being a human being and needing to be sacrificed, why not Mary just pop him out and kill him right there? If that's what it was about. So it has to be about something else. What then could it be about? Is it possible that it is actually about the ways in which God's life is identifying not only with the condition of being human, but also the life of being human? The contingencies and the worries and the joys and the blessedness and the struggle that inside of every single thing that Jesus does, it's also God who is doing those things. That in every single thing that he eats, it is God who is eating. In every house that he enters into, it is God who is entering into that house. And as he does so, is it possible that we could say that he is gathering up all of these experiences of what it means to be human, drawing them into himself and breathing back into them life and restoration and wholeness? That which he does not assume, he does not save. Everything that he does is also doing something to us. He glorifies the body by being in it. We might also say that he glorifies our life by living it. Mercy Odioye, in our next passage, points to the significance of thinking about Jesus' life and the suffering often that happens in the midst of it. She writes, in a continent where physical suffering seems endemic, a suffering Christ is a most attractive figure. For that Christ can be a companion. To the African mind, however, all suffering has to be like birth pangs. It has to lead to a birth. It has to lead to a new beginning. So women create for themselves a Jesus who will midwife the birth of the new in a continent where hunger, thirst, and homelessness are the continuous experience of millions. Jesus of Nazareth is a comrade. But women know that although Jesus took on hunger voluntarily, he never accepted deprivation as the destiny for humanity. So as we begin to think about Jesus' life, we begin to see how his life began to speak to, communicate something to the various aspects of our fallen condition, both individually, right? So every single person that he went to, he was speaking to the ways that each of them were trying to navigate, suture together a kind of life for themselves in the midst of this fallen condition. Sometimes that was created for themselves, sometimes it was pressed on them by these systemic realities. But in every single moment, he meets them, and as he meets them, he brings with him the fullness of God's life, communicates something to them. But we can also say that in Jesus' life, he is also bringing and meeting and communicating something to the social and systemic realities that are also shaping, pressing against this place. We might even suggest that even in his very conception, his very first moments, we begin to see a kind of overturning of a kind of deformation of our fallen condition, of the fallen condition. Namely, the kind of repudiation, the marginalization of women in the lives of Israel and in broader society. Up to this point, women could not be priests. They were not necessarily seen as prophets. And yet, what do we see in Mary's life? Mary begins to read scriptures, right? She is a priest rereading the promises of God. She is a prophet naming how those promises of God are speaking against the principalities and the powers. And she is a priest insofar as that she literally mediates the presence of God into the world. At that very moment, yes, Mary is participating. But notice how Jesus' birth and that relationship with Mary is also an overturning of the social marginalization of women's bodies and lives. Who can say that a woman can't speak after that moment? Who can say that a woman can't? Now, I know a lot of people have tried, right? But part, again, of this power is that Jesus' personhood, God says, she is a priest. When then do we begin to build, to imagine, to work, to move with that life? And so we can say this again and again in Jesus' life. Everywhere he stepped, love and truth radiates from him. He is speaking always to the individual, but he's always also speaking to the systems and the social realities that create those individual conditions. It's always both, always at the same time. And ultimately, this is part of the reason why his life becomes so dangerous. It's not because he was nice to individuals. It's because his body threatened the very systems. It created an alternative system of kinship, an alternative system of love, an alternative way of imagining families. Everywhere he went, it created a kind of Edenic ecosystem, we might say, where people could imagine themselves as bone of bone and flesh of flesh over and against these social boundaries. He creates something now, in his moment. So we might say, actually, in some ways, that the narration of salvation is not about the cross and resurrection. It's actually about his birth and his life. That in his birth and life, he is sowing salvation into us. He is creating spaces of salvation in us in such a way that his life, both after death and resurrection and even before, is a perpetual invitation to swim in the current. Now, what might this mean when we start to think about death next week, the death and resurrection? What's the significance of Jesus' death? Well, we might say then, that which he does not assume, he does not save. In his life, he is taking up every possible condition of our human life, in all of its joys and all of its struggles, in all of its pains and all of its uncertainties. He's drawing it all into himself. But of course, what is one of the things that fundamentally marks our human existence is death itself. So he has to die. But notice the difference here. He doesn't have to die because God demands blood. He doesn't die because God demands punishment for our disobedience. He has to die because if he doesn't die, our death isn't touched. He has to die because God has to communicate the fullness of God's life even to the condition of being dead. Now, womanist and feminist theologians remind us that sometimes we can kind of glorify, there's been a long history of glorifying suffering, and that glorification of suffering almost always comes at the justification of women and marginalized people suffering. And so part of what they suggest is they say, you know what, I think we can say that Jesus had to die, but he didn't have to die that way. for it to be salvific. And I always find this to be super interesting. He could have died at 85. Lots of little goddaughters and godsons and godchildren running around. Peter, still telling Peter what to do. Buried Mary. Living a nice little life. And sits back and looks at all of the fruit of 85 years of life with us. Dies quietly in his sleep. And that would still be salvific. He would still be raised on the third day. But in the midst of our fallen condition, we live in a social system that cannot endure the kind of love, the kind of familial kinships, the kind of neither Jew nor Greek existence that Jesus was creating and cultivating in his midst. And so his love, his life was a dangerous kind of life. It was a life that was going to end in torture. Not because God demanded torture. It was going to end in torture because the social and systemic fallen condition was not going to tolerate that kind of love. And yet Jesus lived that life anyway. He lived a dangerous love knowing that the cross was the end of that road. So when we begin to think next week about Jesus' death, and particularly, and I actually really love that this will be Holy Saturday, we're going to think about what is the significance of the condition of being dead? What is the significance of Jesus sitting in the tomb on that day? And then ultimately, obviously, the resurrection as well. So the question was, how does what we've been doing compare with the disciples' self-understanding and accounts in the Gospels, as well as Peter's in the letters? Right.
Like the rest of the New Testament and early.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like all of these, so every single letter is its own description. So there's not really, to some extent, there's not a kind of coherent Gospels and letters. In some ways, all of those letters are themselves working inside of a kind of argument, right? Even the different Gospels themselves, like some of them are a little bit more bent towards thinking about Jesus' Jewishness and the ways that he's kind of consistent with these kind of Old Testament promises. Others are a little bit more concerned with emphasizing Jesus' divinity, like, so for example, the Gospel of John. The Pauline writings, again, and I say Pauline because Paul didn't write all of them. There are some people that really they felt like they had a great idea, and they think, well, if I say I'm Paul, then more people will pay attention to this. And then it gets in. And so sometimes they're being written to churches that are trying to figure out, like what do we do with all these different people? Like, do we circumcise them or not circumcise them? So I guess it's really hard to kind of talk about this as a blanket and then this particular kind of theological model draws probably like very strongly from Eastern Orthodox notions. Eastern Orthodox notions have a very strong emphasis on communion with God, and the kind of narration of the fall is kind of is a loss of communion, and the incarnation is a restoration of communion. And all built around this idea of theosis, like, so we become like God. So you don't have the kind of same theories of atonement in Eastern Orthodox that you do in kind of the Western Church. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those next week. Yeah. I think part of the way that, maybe even like the ways that I've kind of presented this kind of tends to shy away from theologies that are like statement driven. We are a community because we believe these things. To some extent, even like even part of what I'm trying to maybe kind of move us towards is that we believe in and we move and we participate with God in the ways that we are together. And I think the reason why this is important is that we could say lots of things and also do lots of crappy things at the very same time. And oftentimes this is very much the history of the church, right? Great theology, technically, really crappy ways of thinking of the way that works out. So I think that when we think about what theology is, to me, it's more important for us to think about how are we describing these encounters? How are we in dialogue with people over time? And how does that shape who we think we ought to be, and what it is that we ought to do in any given statement, any given moment? And as we do so, the statements then are actually reflections of who we are, not determinations of who we think we should be. Now, it's not like that's not a super clean, because it's kind of always moving around a little bit. But I do think that part of what's underneath this kind of maybe mishmash of an answer is a value of multiplicity. Because when we start kind of determining that the statements become the kind of arbiter of what constitutes a community, then we argue over the statements, as opposed to saying, once we get to an agreement, we also then close off everything. Whereas a kind of value of multiplicity is to say, wait a second, it's possible that all of these different people are bringing encounters. And I think it also gives us room to actually begin to critique our own practices in certain kinds of ways, especially when a community that does not necessarily seem to speak as Christian or have the markers that we think reflects to us behaviors and ways and patterns of love that we actually need to be more responsive to. So it actually allows us for a kind of both ecumenical and maybe even kind of interfaith way of thinking about what does it mean to be who we are, but also be open to these dialogues and these conversations and mutual formations too. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everybody. 1 week to go. I can't wait to have theology class on Holy Saturday. It makes me so excited. All right, see y'all next week.